Good evening. I guess we'll start the workshop on the legislative priorities. Scott, do you want to start us off?
Thanks, Mayor. Good evening, everybody. Before we get started, I guess I want to give a thanks to Jason Roloff and Jennifer Smith who helped pull all this together for me. So if you like it, it's their credit. If you don't like it, it's probably because I screwed it up tonight. So we've got a pretty decent prepared presentation to go through. And then obviously we want to provide opportunity for you to provide feedback and have discussion amongst yourselves. Also joining us and available after we get done with the presentation is Tristan from Merchant McIntyre. So he's available for questions. He's online and available after we do the presentation. So if you have questions about things related to the federal lobbying efforts that we have, he'd be available to answer those questions. I'll try to speak into this mic because I think it helps with the sound. So the plan is to remind us of the vision, mission, values, and how they relate to what we determine are the priorities. The council will do a little review of what the council determined as 23 and 24 legislative priorities, kind of what our progress has been on those. Focus on a little bit about assumptions in our strategy, the draft 25-26 legislative priorities based on your feedback, and the plans that have been approved by the city, and consultation with Merchant McIntyre executive team and others about the most practical things that will be funded federal and statewide. So then we'll put together some discussion on the future priorities, and those are things that we're not recommending at this time be direct lobbying, but it's something we start to think about getting into our conversations with legislators at some point soon. Recall that we have set our vision, and then our mission is to coordinate and deliver essential services and ensure a sustainable future. We take a look at this when we're looking at the context of the plans that are approved and setting out what we think are going to be important ways to connect our legislative lobbying efforts with the mission of the city and the vision, and then consistent with our values. So one thing I want to note about legislative priorities is they're not an exact match with the other stated priorities of the city. So obviously you set out strategic priorities and you set a work plan based on what you think are the absolute top for each year. Although we'd like to obtain funding for all of those things through federal and state means, we don't think that that's practical consideration. So even though the council may say this is our number one priority, it may not match the priority of the federal or state government. In that case, we wouldn't just lobby on it because we think it's important. We want to try to focus our legislative efforts on the things that are of importance to you that have the most practical opportunity for funding from federal and state government. It doesn't mean we stop working on those priorities. It just means we've got to find other means to get those accomplished. An example that isn't perfect for this is, obviously EAB, Emerald Ash Borer it's a priority of the city. We've said we're going to try to take care of it. We're going to try to do it with some urgency. There doesn't seem to be an opportunity to get federal and state funding for that. That isn't the priority. We haven't heard the White House or the governor's office say we want to help cities out with that. So even though it's something we have on our work plan, we're working on it. We think it's critical for the vision, mission, and values of the city. You won't see it in our legislative priority recommendations. Now, the flip side of that is there are times when we do lobby things that we don't think we have much of a chance because you've determined that it's so important for us, we just want to say it. My advice usually is be thoughtful about how many times you say stuff that you don't actually think you're going to get funded. An example of that would be like shared revenues. For years, it was like, what are you guys doing to us? Well, we didn't make it a priority every single year to just kind of hammer the legislature about it. But as we saw some changes in the political landscape and we thought was more of an opportunity, even though we thought, there was only a 10% chance of getting it, we started lobbying for the shared revenue. Well, then 5 or 6 years later, we finally got to that 51% chance of it happening, and so we put all muster into it. Does that make sense to the council? And is that, I think that's consistent with what you would expect us to do. You certainly have the opportunity, though, to determine that something is a legislative priority, even if you're not optimistic about us getting money. So if there's something that the council as a collective feels that you just want to make that message out there, you can do that. I will tell you that that's not what staff has kind of brought up for you. So that'd be something we'd have to hear from you saying, we know that this isn't something we're probably going to get funded, but it's so important to us as a collective council that we want you to put it on the legislative. We want it on the mayor's lips when he's talking to him. We want to deal with this. But with the caveat that there's not a lot of that in the legislative priorities that we drafted for you to discuss. The good news is when we put our mind to things and we align our priorities with things that we think have a practical opportunity for success at the federal and state level, we were successful. I certainly won't let you expect that this is what's going to happen every year, but every one of your legislative priorities was met in the last legislative priority list, which is pretty incredible. So that we had both modernize the current state and local funding partnership and try to get a portion of the sales tax. They kind of combined that together. It resulted in changing legislation and more money for cities. Man Valley obviously was a priority, and we forwarded that. Not only did we forward the priority of getting some help, but we got significant help on the state end to the extent that the project was well under budget for local funds. Fire station improvements was something that you identified as a priority. We were able to go out and do congressionally directed spending towards that. Kinney Corridor project plans, we had a lot of concern about how was Army Corps going to proceed? Were they going to proceed? Were they not going to proceed? And was there going to be enough money for it? And not only were we able to get Army Corps to proceed with the feasibility, but through lobbying efforts, we've been able to increase the 206 maximum from the 10 or $12 million up to the $15 million limit. So we were able to keep their interest going and increase the potential amount of federal money. And then also on the transportation projects, we were successful in getting the Wasson Lane project going and keeping some pressure on the state also for projects in our area. So I think a success to you as a council for picking legislative priorities that you thought were winners, kind of setting some stretch goals for us as staff and Merchant McIntyre, and we've been able to go out there and meet that. I'm going to really quickly go through this bulleted list with a little bit more detail just to remind us what we've accomplished. So the state and local partnership I talked about a little bit. Man Valley, we talked about how we've put that together. The fire station, so let me follow the presentation a little bit. So the Act 12 in 2024 eliminated local property taxes, but it added a supplemental shared revenue payment. So the city's state shared revenue went from 1.69 million in 23 to 2.15 million in 2024. So that was a 21% increase in the level of state shared revenue. Now, we haven't just shifted everything to rely on shared revenue. We're still being cautious in our overall fiscal plan to not overly rely on state money. But certainly that's a pretty big, that's a significant room. And it really, I think, was part of the impetus that the council felt comfortable going forward with a very significant fire station project, because you now had the backing of the state as a partner where you thought there was some projection of real partnership going forward. So that was a really important lobbying effort. I was part of the task force or committee, I can't remember what they called it, that the League of Municipalities, the Towns Association, the Counties Association, the Realtors, I think the builders were in there too. So I represented you and your interests there, and we were successful in moving that forward. And then Man Valley, was a purchase back in 2011. You created the TID district, and then, this is something that you're talking about adding over $100 million in new value to the city over the next, 10 years. it could be up to 250 million in new value by the TID close. And so you're able to go out and get that grant for the trail, which is an immediate quality of life improvement for all the folks that live in this area, not just for the corporate park, but it's something that you're able to get some tangible improvements right away. And the fire station we talked about is a $10 million plan for renovations. That has a mix of local, state, and federal funding. The council made that a priority. We've actually, as we did with the police station, we were able to kind of move it up from where we planned to do the project. We were able to kind of find a way to move it up a few years in the project. And so we're currently doing design. We expect to bid this year and get it under construction. And we're hoping that construction is going to be done by 2026, the end of 26. 1.4 million in USDA funds was allocated to the project to the congressionally directed spending. So that was sponsored by Van Orden and Baldwin, Senator Baldwin, Representative Van Orden and Senator Baldwin. And then again, I think really you can look at the state as being a partner in this project, because that additional state shared revenue, you didn't say as a council, let's just find a way to spend that in operating. You looked at your priorities and said the fire station's a priority. We're going to direct that money to the debt service at the fire station, which really allowed you to pull that project up. So what are our assumptions going into building? Why, what are we assuming about the world and the state of affairs, and what reason do we have to go out and do legislative priorities at all? Aren't we too small to worry about this? Shouldn't we let Milwaukee, Madison, and others worry about legislative priorities, and we'll just kind of take the crumbs that come from that? I think is the question that people might ask. And that's a fair question. Why would you spend money and resources and staff time pursuing state and federal money? Shouldn't we just automatically get it because we put in competitive processes or grants? Or shouldn't we expect that the efforts of the larger cities are just going to trickle down to us? And I think the answer is we should not expect that to be the case. That the cities that have been pretty consistently competitive in the area of federal and state funding have done it through a plan and active engagement in the process. So there's certainly policy points to be made about whether this is the way you should have to do it. I think we've taken a pragmatic approach that this is just how it is done. You have to engage your legislative cohort. You have to do the travel. You have to do the strategy and the planning to get results. So we think so we're making an assumption that federal funding is essential to supplement the local money that we're able to contribute, and even the state money. And so again, it is our money. It's the same folks' money, right, that we send to Washington or the state. You certainly can make a reasonable argument that we shouldn't try to go get that. It'll just lower the cost of state and federal government overall. That's a reasonable argument. It doesn't seem to be the lay of the land that we're currently operating in, even with the recent changes in federal administration. So we started a partnership with Merchant McIntyre in 2022, and that's been key to getting some progress on this. Grants and earmarks enable the city to fund major projects. So that's one of our assumptions, is that some of these projects either wouldn't be able to be done, or we would have to put off for quite a bit longer if we were solely relying on what we could generate locally. We're making the assumption that we have to try to think about inflation mitigation, that there's going to be inflation in prices, services, and other things. And one of the tools that we can do to help buffer the local taxpayer is to try to get some of their money back for projects that are doing that. And also when we lobby for legislative changes, we're trying to legislate changes that will reduce the overall cost. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the regulatory environment, in particular around hydro licensing and how much we had to spend for that versus if there was some different regulatory environment, we would have spent less as a city to try to do that. We also are, one of the assumptions we're making is that we have things that are very critical to our success as a city, one of those being tax incremental financing. And so we're very sensitive to what's going on from a legislative standpoint and we want to make sure we can still leverage those important tools. And so we're kind of guarded about, okay, what's going on in the legislative world that's going to impact our ability to use this tool that we think is really important for us. So that we're making the assumption that you want to try to keep the tools in the toolbox. And if the state wants to clamp down or change those things, that we're gonna kind of aggressively do that. One of the other assumptions we've made in putting this together is that we're going to have to keep doing infrastructure, that it's going to be one of the main things that we do. Many of the infrastructure projects that we put together over time have been funded in partnership with state or federal government at one point. You know, wastewater and water infrastructure, a lot of these things historically have had local, state, and or federal financing to do the original infrastructure. So one of the assumptions we're making is, why wouldn't we continue that partnership when we're rehabbing, expanding, or maintaining that infrastructure? We've made some assumption that the hydropower licensing right now makes no sense. That the process used for the 2 tiny dams on the Kinney River is the same process as the Hoover Dam. That doesn't make a lot of logical sense for us. Even when the federal government says, well, you have some flexibility and we've got this different process. Again, when you look at those processes, they're pretty identical to what the largest dam in the country goes through. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That may not help us much, but we kind of feel like we can help other cities that are going to go through this in the future. And it may in fact help us to stop from having to spend additional money on regulatory things that don't make a lot of sense to us. Another assumption that we made is one of the things that we think is both a priority of our community and impacts our law enforcement, public safety infrastructure, but also may align currently with the state and federal priorities, and in particular state priorities, is mental health. And so that's one of the areas where we're like, we need to figure out, can we make an impact? Excuse me. So that also is kind of like emergency response mental health, but it specifically is also on law enforcement's role in being a primary responder to mental health, and whether that makes a lot of sense long term for our state. It's not unique in the country. It's pretty unique in the region. I mean, our neighboring states have different ways of handling it and put police officers in a different role than Wisconsin does. So that's, and we also heard, one of the assumptions that we're using is when you adopt a plan, that's an important thing for us to consider, that we don't just do the plans to say, well, that's aspirational and hopefully someday we'll get there. So when you adopt the Kinney Corridor Plan, we are constantly looking for strategies to try to get that implemented. And that's because you've got the National Community Survey results and other things that are guiding you as to what the public is looking for. So 2025-26 legislative priorities that are taking shape are primarily in these buckets. Straight out pursuit of federal funding, trying to do some kind of inflation mitigation, whether that be federal funding to help us offset cost increases, or trying to change the regulatory environment to reduce the cost of us providing a service. Or in the case of state government, mitigate the bad inflationary impacts of the tax levy limits, where they incentivized us to borrow rather than just pay our bills up front, which has an inflationary impact. We understand you want to continue progress on infrastructure, and then we want to focus on improving public safety. So those are kind of the broad buckets. Understanding, we know that a lot of this stuff is future focused, that we may not be able to get the result in 26, that we're trying to get things lined up for the future. So in particular, federal funding, we'll continue with our partnership with Merchant McIntyre. There's some examples there of things that we've been able to access with their assistance. We're going to keep working with them on those things. Again, it looks to be Kinney Corridor is the primary thing that we want to go after for federal earmarks and things. if we get along the process, if we hear from the legislative aides that they'd like us to just leave that in the 206 program and kind of leave enough alone, then we likely would focus on public safety, probably in the radio area, radio and communications. We want to work on some of these inflation, what we consider to be inflation mitigation. We think TID is a big deal. It's a kind of got a proven track record for us. We are not in danger of running into the 12% rule. At current, we're about 8%. But we know if we're successful in doing economic development, it isn't going to be that long before you run into that limit. And then you're faced with the idea that you just stop doing it for a while, or you try to grab everything at once at some point right before you hit the 12%. We don't think either one of those are good policy aims, and so we're hoping to work with the legislator to say there needs to be a different path. Turning off the switch when you get to 12 is not a good path, or trying to grab a whole bunch as a last ditch effort where you're going to jump to like 20 or 30%, but then you're going to have to run those TIDs out. That's not a good way to do things either. We think that the state is tied to that because the success in all these tax incremental financing districts is basically building the state. Levy limit changes, I think you all are very familiar. Just for the public, I'll just reiterate that the current levy caps we are not suffering as a community from the inability to raise taxes. What we are suffering from is, in order to have reasonable inflationary increases in levy, our finance department is being asked to do that increasingly through debt service in order to maintain that. In other words, it's a formula basis only. We're not asking the legislature to go out and give us $2 or $3 million more in levy capacity. We're just saying, let us pay for our debt however we want and take that out of the equation. We don't believe that incentivizes things. Cities should not be incentivized to take on a bunch of debt so that they can work through the levy limit. And then we've talked before, I think, about retention of municipal bond tax exempt status. We think that has a pretty significant impact on inflation. If the exemption for bonds is removed and we still have to use bonds as a primary financing for infrastructure projects, in particular utility projects, that limitation is going to drive up the cost of borrowing there. That'll be a policy decision the federal policymakers have to make. There's again a big push to take, to monetize how much that discount is for municipalities, hospitals, and others that use that nonprofit tax exempt status for bonding. But if you change that tax exempt, it's been estimated, even I think by federal sources, to be like $12 trillion in savings to cities. So yes, you could take that away from us. We'll pay $12 trillion more in borrowing costs, and then potentially the federal government could give that $12 trillion back to the taxpayers in income taxes. So I understand the trade-offs there, but we are thinking as a city, our lobbying should be that we don't want tax exempt status to go away, that we're better off keeping that where it helps everybody keep their costs down. And then, our experience with hydropower relicensing is that it's very expensive. And all through the process, we're trying to prove things that virtually every person can see with their own eyes. Yet you have to go through, $100,000, $50,000 studies to evaluate, which could make sense when you have bigger stakes, bigger water bodies, more dangerous or high hazard dams than we have. But it certainly doesn't make a lot of sense for small dams. I'm getting towards the end, so we can have a chat. This, Kenny, I would say, unless we're told differently from the council, this remains our number one priority, to try to figure out any way that we can keep the resources that we've already got pledged towards it from the federal government, and see if there's ways to enhance those. So the Kinney corridor as planned right now, for the restoration of the riverway is about a $20 million estimated project. We were successful in getting the Army Corps of Engineers to come in on a partnership. We've been successful in changing federal language to allow more participation by the federal government than was allowed when we started. And so we're still kind of methodically working through that here 8 months after the Army Corps started their feasibility and presented that to the city council. So we're working along that. And to the extent we can find a way for the federal government to kind of push that forward, enhance, accelerate, or give us the money, we understand that the council is prepared to go forward with the project that the community has developed. So these are some infrastructure things that we're thinking about. They probably are going to be things that we can't get everything in 25, 26, but we're starting to think about it. So we want to get on the radar, continue Highway 35 as a 4 lane so we can get it, from where it stops being a 4 lane now, at least past Cemetery. I think that kind of sets the community up for future growth. And as you know, with Radio Road, with the original 35, all of those projects take decades to get done. So you have to start the lobbying, start working through the process, and 18 to 20 years from now, the state will adopt that as part of their plan and do that work. So nobody should expect that this is coming next year. We want to continue our efforts with Build. That is the new name for RAISE. So RAISE is the Biden administration name for transportation infrastructure. Build is the Trump administration name for infrastructure. The transportation secretary is from Wisconsin now. So Secretary Duffy, we think there's some opportunities there to enhance our standing in that competition. We have shifted the focus based on advice from Merchant McIntyre that really we should be focusing on Main Street. Our original raise was some north, south, east, west thoroughfares. In particular, was division from west side of town all the way through the east side. It included some Main Street, obviously intersections, Second Street, Main. I'm sorry, Second Street and Division, Main and Division, Bob White and Division, but we don't think that's going to be as attractive to the current administration as doing a Main Street commerce centered transportation focused project. So you're really talking about going to Main and Second now as your big, potentially Main from tip to tail. So potentially North Main down to South Main as we put the planning grants together. But I think focusing on the Main Street redevelopment is going to be a lot more potentially successful than going at kind of the corridor from Division, which the Division plan originally was to include some of the we don't have much historically disadvantaged neighborhoods or census tracts. That was a way to pick a few up and position us for better opportunities. That doesn't look like that's going to be a considerable factor in the current transportation infrastructure funding. And then water seems to be something that's of interest at the state and federal level, in particular drinking water. And we'll need, you'll be presented the water and sewer plans in the coming month or two. And obviously we have some improvements there, in particular a new well in the north zone. So that's something we'd think to try to find a way to line up. And then we'll also probably need one in the east zone at some point, but that's a little bit farther down. And I hope I'm not mixing those two up, which is first. Then mental health access, just quickly to go through that. You identified it as priority in 2021. We were successful in getting the state to include it in their budget, but have not been successful. The state has not implemented the budget. this really is a strain on law enforcement. So it has an operational impact and cost for us to transport folks, but it really, frankly, it's our law enforcement, and the chief can speak differently. They're witnessing the cruelty of our current system on a weekly basis. It doesn't work. It's not very humane. And so we need to get, and the state is the most likely person to put the resources in and help us out. It's not something we can take on as our, we are not going to build a mental health facility in the city of River Falls to take care of our residents. It's not something that we're really equipped to do. And so we're going to really continue to work hard on that. Our chief has been included in some of the statewide groups trying to make progress on this. But we're going to basically keep the message going that we've got to keep the pressure on the state in particular. And if we find a way to match it with the federal priorities, we'll try to do that too. I can go into more detail on that, but I think I want to try to keep it a higher level. And certainly we can go into that. But again, I think even though this is not a service necessarily that we intend to provide directly, we are providing a service directly in the mental health area through our law enforcement. We think that although they're compassionate and capable and are doing the best they can with it every time they encounter it, we know there's other systems that are a lot better than what we have currently. These are what I told you at the beginning. We're kind of future, so we want you to start thinking about them. These would be the ones, if you look at any of these and go, we don't want you staff to ever spend any time on that. We certainly would like the stop sign to say that's not something that's even on our radar. We think coming up, so the next one or the one after that for legislative priorities will probably include some of these things. But the home rule utility, trying to find a way for our electric utilities, since we have good local control and local boards, local council, most states have modeled them more off of the co-op model than the regulated material. We have a lot more in common with the co-ops than we do with Excel, but yet we're regulated the same as Excel. So we think there's probably some things that need to change there. That will be a tough one to accomplish. The downtown plan, the council said loud and clear, we're impatient. We want you to go. Let's go. When can we get going? There's always something that, takes priority, the fire station or whatever, but that's going to be, we're pretty close now where that's next on the list. And so we think because we got a good comprehensive plan and we will end up with a good downtown plan that we're going to be in a position to leverage that to get some funding. State block grant funding, we think, is something that might have an opportunity here with a new way of looking at the federal government giving money. CDBG block grants, there's entitlement communities and non-entitlement communities. Originally when the Nixon administration was, I believe this to be the history, originally when the Nixon administration did that, he essentially wanted to bypass the states. Like he felt more comfortable with city councils than with state legislatures and governors. And so a lot of communities in the country still get direct allocation of federal income tax from the federal government because they felt that was going to be more efficiently looked after, cared for. And obviously there's some sentiment in the current federal administration that would be beneficial. We are not an entitlement community. We're too small at current to be an entitlement community. It literally takes an act of Congress to get you moved into that category. And so we think there may be a reason at some point for us to try to move ourselves into that category. It would give the council more flexibility to deal with some of the poverty and other problems that they see in front of them using some of the resources and revenue from the federal government, similar to hundreds of communities across the country. And then shared revenue, I think we don't think that's done. It's something that'll have to continue to get pressure on it because it is important to the way things work and how we fund things. So we're going to keep leveraging the work of past and present councils. We think it's important to have dedicated staff kind of thinking about this on a regular basis, how they leverage outside resources. We're going to keep working towards this prosperous future that we've set out in our mission, vision, and values. And for the 25-26 legislative cycle, we think that we've got a pretty good list, but we're interested to understand if the council thinks we've missed the mark. If there's things on the list that you are thinking need a little bit more discussion, or things that you're surprised that you don't see on our list, based on conversations that you've had in public, with your plans and other approvals, resolutions, and other things. So, and your understanding of the current environment for us to get that money. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Mayor, and Tristan's available for Merchant McIntyre, and obviously I'm available also to answer questions as I can.
Well, does anybody want to start?
Mr. Mayor, I have a question. So I'm not, I wouldn't say we entirely missed the mark, but I guess I'd like to see more clarity. One of our major priorities should be improving our ability to use TIDs for low income and affordable housing, and working with the municipal league to target that. And another aspect of that would be improve zoning, working with them to do that as well. And I think that should be one of our major priorities. And I think that's somewhat in there.
So I understand your point about housing.
Yeah.
We haven't specifically included that. It's certainly something that the council could decide that you want to have more. I think I understand your point on that one. There is a push amongst many communities to expand the ability to use tax incremental financing district for more residential projects. I'm not advocating for that, but that's something that's a legitimate policy decision for the council, and certainly we could add that to our specific requests on TID. The second one, I'm a little less, I need a little more clarification on.
It would be, so that would probably
Zoning.
be part of that, and the zoning would be for low income and affordable housing, for finding and developing improvements to it. So it'd be two parts of the same one.
Okay, you're talking specifically for the ability to use TID, tax incremental financing, to finance low to moderate income housing?
Yep.
Okay.
And I have a related question. What is it? Where does the 12% come from? What does that number mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. You can have a maximum of 12% of your total assessed valuation in a TID. So that was done to prevent cities from basically just TIDing their whole city.
Okay.
Which means, no, all new taxes are going to pay the city for its infrastructure. 12% was a rule that was put in place in order to, say you can have targeted specific development areas. The challenge is 12% was made at a time where, a big economic development project was $1 million.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a big economic development project now is $200 million. So if you're a $1 billion city, it doesn't take much if you have a $200 million project to kind of work yourself above 12%.
Got it.
Mr. Mayor, I've got a couple.
Scott, you had mentioned, and I'm a big supporter of the mental health initiative, but you'd mentioned that we have to be careful about continually beating the same drum with limited results. We've been doing this since 2021, I think you said. What do we need to do different in order to start getting more of an impact on the mental health? I know every time I see one of our state legislators, Representative Krybeck, Zimmerman, Stashold, that is something that I bring up to them every single time. And they agree, but I think it's just, yeah, I know we've already heard it from you. But what do we need to do different? Because what we're doing now doesn't seem to be having the impact. And when I say we, I mean the legislative lobbying through the St. Croix County EDC, the Pierce County EDC, the different chambers of commerce that go down and do the lobbying at the Capitol or through Merchant McIntyre. What do we need to do different? Because we need to figure out a different path here.
Perhaps we do. I'm not sure that, I think what staff's advice to you is that you need to continue to formally indicate that it's a priority. Frankly, at the, your trade, at the trade-off of there's other things you're not including. Because
Right.
one of our strategies also with legislative priorities is not to have 100 of them. Because we've seen that doesn't work.
No.
So I do think it matters if councils, I think it would be better if more councils were doing that. I think you've given us full support to have your staff, including your police chief, who has a lot of pull within the state law enforcement community and increasingly in state mental health community. So I'm not sure what you can change other than I don't think that your behavior is similar to others. I don't know that councils across the state are, every time they see their legislator, are saying something, so I think you need to keep doing that. This is our best advice to you as a council, that one of the ways to keep your voice heard is to say, this is really important to us. And then at some point, I think councils will want to challenge the legislature, which is a dangerous thing, and say, you told us you were gonna do this, you admitted that this was not working right. We've identified ways that don't break the bank to deal with this. Why hasn't it been done? And essentially hold them accountable for, it doesn't help to keep agreeing with us that the policies need to be changed and things need to be funded if you don't actually change the policies or fund it, which we don't have any power to do. They have all the power to do. So that probably wasn't a great answer, but it's how we're feeling. Those of us that are kind of been in the trenches trying to do this is like, I don't know that we have to change anything. I think the state legislature has to decide that this is important. We may be faced with a decision, which they haven't put us in a position yet, where they come back to cities and say, okay, if you want this in mental health, we're gonna take this from you. But that's not even the choice that you're faced with. So right now they're saying, yeah, we agree. Thanks for all your advice and counsel. We're gonna take care of it. So we're cautiously, I think I am cautiously optimistic. I don't think I'm pessimistic on this one.
Okay.
I think it impacts too many families. It's pretty broad. It's not red or blue. It's, it's hitting families all across the state. And so that at some point it has to work itself into the legislature's nomenclature.
Now I got an even harder question for you. And this is gonna seem like, why are you venturing into something that's not your business? The state school funding method is as broken as shared revenue was. If we continue to see the need for school districts to have operating levies, I firmly believe that impacts, obviously, the residents of our community, and it impacts the city's ability to grow or to look at revenue options through levy. What can we start to do to encourage our fellow elected officials in the school district locally and statewide to start advocating for themselves to start doing that? This is way harder than the other question. Let's probably want to go back to that.
Yeah, I don't know if I have the answer to that too. So I'll give you just a couple of things you can think about. You can include legislative priorities that aren't what would traditionally be considered direct benefits to the local mix of services that you are in charge of as a city. We've done that before. We advocated for the Falcon Center. We advocated for the SciTech. So in that case, the council made a specific decision that we're not getting tax revenue from it. It's not kind of filling our coffers or changing our services, but we think that the university is so important to us, and those projects in particular are so important to their success or survival, that we're going to use some of our clout as their friends, their partners to do that. So you don't have a lot of limitation. I mean, if there's something that's really important to you as a council, you can decide that that's something you do. You can imagine I would caution you to get too far. Because if you're going to do it right, you really need to understand it fully. You need to figure out what the strategies are, and you kind of need to get right in there with them, which I think we kind of did with the Falcon Center and the SciTech. We knew kind of the list of pros and cons and what the impact was going to be, and we felt strongly enough to include it. And I do think there was trade-offs there. I mean, I think there's things when they were funded for their project, certainly it impacted what other projects would get funded in the region. So we were making a trade-off, and it could be the same with school funding. I mean, we could decide as a city that we're not going to look for shared revenue increases and other things because we want to make space somewhat for school district funding reform. So does that answer that question?
That
I think
answers
that's
that
about as
question.
best as I can answer it.
It's really more about how can we help the school district start advocating for themselves? Every time I've had a conversation with a school board member, they've said, that's an impossible task and nobody's willing to see.
Well, I think
it." So
one
to-
thing
to
that you
start
could,
the conversation.
yeah, I think one thing you can do is say, look what we did.
Well, I did.
Not in a bragging way, but to say, we were in your same boat. We were sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Yeah.
And so we decided we needed a bigger number of partners. Like I said, they included the realtors and builders and other people in to say, because they weren't just listening to cities.
Right.
So I think you can show them the model that we came up with and it was successful. And I think that's probably the way the schools are going to have to do it. I think things in some ways the cities felt things got a lot worse for us than it has yet for the schools. But I think that's a policy judgment. I don't think you can factually determine that,
No, but my point is it's gonna take them a number, excuse me, it's gonna take them a number of years in order to gather their efforts, just like it took us a number of years. And the sooner they start, the sooner they can maybe see some change.
Yeah, I mean, shared revenue was like 5 blue ribbon
Yeah.
commissions and 40 years later,
Yeah,
right? It was
exactly.
like, it took, people with short memories are like, well, wow, that was pretty good. You did that. You got a group together, you went to Capitol and got what you needed. It's
Yeah.
like, well, we're not going to break our arm patting ourselves in the back because there was a lot of groundwork laid for years and years. And frankly, some really bad streets in other parts of the state that helped us get that through, right? Because they hadn't been as successful as us as keeping services going.
All right, thank you. That's all I have, Mayor.
I agree with the legislative priorities. I would like to wordsmith something if we could. The improving public safety when we're talking about mental health creates a unintentional, I think, belief that people with mental health crises are dangerous. So I would really like it to say something like increasing mental health supports or mental health resources versus public safety, because we don't want people to feel like if you're having a mental health crisis, you're suddenly dangerous to the community.
Alyssa,
Yeah, and I would agree. The language you used was not intending to make a judgment about. We were basically saying our current public safety net is dangerous to people with mental health.
Right. And I
problems.
don't think that, and I agree and understand what you're saying. And I don't think that if an average layperson who was reading it would understand that's what you meant. I don't think you're saying people with mental health crises are dangerous.
Councilmember Mueller, you're suggesting that mental health awareness, I think, right? Is awareness maybe the word?
No, just that what we're trying to do, which increases, everyone's safety, but to say we are trying to increase mental health resources for people in this community, not to say that if you're just a lay person reading this, it could be taken as saying people with mental health crises who need support and transportation from the police department are in fact dangerous. And so we want to make sure that we don't send that message.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
I agree with what you're saying, but I also think that, if we talk about increasing mental health resources for people in the community, this is a very specific need. It's not like we're generally increasing mental health resources, but, so maybe
I also like the word supports.
crisis. Yeah,
Supports.
mental health crisis support.
Yeah, I'm fine with any of, that's fine. I don't mind.
We can work on some language for the resolution too, because we could, instead of the bullet point being improve public safety by advocating for hospital beds, we could say improving mental health crisis supports by, and it's
Yeah. And I don't
going to
think,
have similar impacts, and that's a good clarification.
right,
We are not this is not the city of River Falls saying we need all the mental health stuff.
right.
There's a lot of mental health things that we could probably use support in, reform in, assistance. This right now is frankly dealing with some of the people in the biggest crisis of their lives,
Mhm.
where right now the tools are pretty limited and the responders are primarily police patrol officers, and so we're trying to figure out a better way so that mental health crisis supports make some sense.
Yeah, and I think the average person also doesn't realize that state law requires that a like they can't be transported by ambulance, they have to be transported by a police officer. I don't think people understand that. So they don't understand that that does impact public safety because our officers are not in our community providing that support. And so I think, I don't think people understand that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I don't think people have an understanding of the magnitude of
Yeah.
the impacts of this issue, which is also why I think there should be lots of people coalescing around this, because I suppose you could find somebody, I don't know who they would be. If you find somebody that doesn't really care that much about making sure somebody gets mental health hospitalization, they still probably care that you've taken that officer out of service for so many hours. And so there's all kinds of people that are impacted by it. It really has a pretty big ripple, not to mention the impact it has on officers even wanting to continue. And I don't want to make a broad generalization, but certainly all these things impact people going into professional law enforcement. It's like, well, they went into law enforcement to help people. So helping people is a good thing. But if your job shifts to you're the primary crisis responder for mental health, and then you know that you're probably not helping that person, it's not helping the system that we have. That's a problem too for recruitment, retention, other things. So there's just all kinds of aspects that people probably don't understand. And most people still live in one state for most of their life, and so they don't even know what's out there in the world beyond where they live. So, okay.
Another topic, but talking about laying the groundwork and 30 to 40 years, and it wasn't part of our lists there, but how do we start putting together plans, and is it with the county or with the state for our additional bypass, say from 65 down to down to 29, down to Cemetery Road, and how does that all occur? How do we make that happen?
So we've started the very initial discussions now. We start to get it in our plans, which is one of the things we need to do pretty specifically. Because there's going to have to be some consents. I think you have to get almost to consensus on the council of what is critical major infrastructure projects. Probably just getting a basic majority to support a project like that doesn't really give it a lot of steam. But I think what you're talking about is essentially like a Pierce County, St. Croix County highway that's bisecting those highways on the east, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So it's on staff's radar. We're not sure there's a good program yet for it for us, and we also have almost no buy-in from the two counties yet. So we think the strategy is start working the counties, which we have, talk to the transportation commissioners, the county administrators, the county board members and say, we think this is a future thing. You kind of get over the initial reaction of, we don't do, there's not gonna be any new county highways, we can't afford to do that. And then you start working in the economic development discussion. And then as you saw, when we attended the Pierce County EDC meetings, we started saying, hey, here's something to put on your radar. Cause they were doing the brainstorm of public infrastructure projects that could encourage economic development support. So that's how I see it happening. The council really, again, you can press on the gas or the brake. That's one of your roles as a policymaker, is if you're like, staff isn't putting enough emphasis on this, or council as a whole, then you can tell us you want to make that a higher priority. I don't believe that one's even in the CIP yet, so we've got to figure out how to decide if we want to get it moved up in the CIP, which then obviously would set things in motion a little bit faster. Does that make sense?
Yep, it does.
Because we probably can't get funding for something from the feds unless we have it at least in our CIP plan.
I have a question about federal funding. So a lot's been happening, and I guess I need some clarification about the Kinney Corridor project. We've been through the feasibility studies with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We were allocated or approved, I don't know which word is correct, for the money, right?
We don't have a project agreement yet.
Okay.
We're the status that we're at. I should have brought my project status. We still have more approval steps to go.
Okay.
So it's not a sure thing that we are in the 206 future funding for implementation. Right now, we're still in the feasibility phase where they have said, yep, it's feasible. And then we're trying to shift them into the funding phase where we have to do project agreements and all kinds of things. I don't know if Tristan is the right person to ask for status.
Is it the same with the funding for the fire department? So what I guess I'm trying to understand, and I understand that you guys are not like, you don't have a magic ball, but like, are we as a city, if the federal funding doesn't come through, that's going to drastically, I would assume, drastically change the way in which we're going to go about these projects?
Yes, I think if you lose 10 to 15 million out of the Kinney Corridor in federal funding, it's not just go to plan B, it's like figure out what the new plan A is.
Right.
The fire station, I think, is less dramatic and also a little bit more secure. Like, we're farther in the stage with the USDA. We just finished up the environmental review. So we're getting pretty close where you can execute kind of the final document stage. And that was a congressionally directed spending. So basically they've been told by Congress, you're doing this project.
Okay.
That doesn't mean all risk is gone. It doesn't mean that you couldn't have a presidential executive order or something get hung up. We're fairly optimistic about the fire station funding right now. We're fairly optimistic about Army Corps because Army Corps so far we have not seen dramatic or drastic impacts to the staff that we're working with or the office operations. Things seem to be fairly normal. Again, I don't want to bring the ire on them, but it seems a little more regular. Like we cannot contact any Department of Energy staff that were working on the Energy Futures Grant.
Right. And so,
like they don't appear to be there anymore. We haven't had an formal update since November. That's not the case with Army Corps. Army Corps was even on the ground in River Falls in the last month. So
yeah. So in this budget that was passed by the House, the federal House, that has does that have the funding for the fire station, and would that have the funding for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers? Is that
Army Corps of Engineers would still be part of the appropriations process.
okay?
the fire station money is in the previous, budget. And we do, there again, we've got a USDA contact staff person that we're working with. That's
Still there.
still there and everything is working pretty well. That being said, we've asked the project team on the fire station to have a fallback if we lose 1.4 million in the budget.
Right.
The fallback isn't just pretend nothing happened and go ahead with the bids. We're not sure the fallback is reduce the project by 1.4 million. We might have to come back to council and say, we can reduce the project by 800,000, but the trade-offs get too great. That one's a little more complicated too, because we're still waiting for our rural partners to officially and finally say, here we are, we're ready, we know this is important, here's our money. So that's another $2-ish million. So we need to figure that out, because the city, we're in pretty good shape with our 7 million.
Mhm.
We have the federal government and the rural partners to kind of get secured up. So I hope we're not coming to the council with a bid and no security from those two. I don't want to put you in that position. I wouldn't say it's out of the question. We may decide as a project team that, yep, rural is in, they gave us their commitment. We've got our own money. We don't have any commitment from the federal, but we don't want to wait any longer to get this bid out. And then we'll be asking you to tell us if that's okay or not. But there's nothing that predictable about the federal government, even in normal circumstances. And so we're not in any kind of normal circumstances right now.
Right.
So,
Thanks.
does that make sense?
It does. I was just trying to get it straight in my head.
So even if we had project agreements for things, I'd be very concerned if we actually couldn't get any emails from the federal staff that was in charge of that project agreement. Right now, we don't have that situation. Right now, we don't have an agreement on energy futures and we can't get a hold of any staff.
Okay.
For USDA, we're on our way to the final project agreement and we can get a hold of the staff. Army Corps, we knew we weren't done. We still have several steps, but it's consistent communication with staff. It seems to be in better overall shape. But it may just be that it hasn't been their turn yet, so.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions?
So what you can do, I mean, the action items for you here are none. The action items for you here were to discuss in a workshop format. Kind of give us an idea if we had hit the bullseye mostly, if we were not hit the bullseye. And then we have available for you tonight the ability for you to pass the legislative priorities and a resolution doing so. As always, if the council wants more time, more information, more research, more refinement, you have the ability tonight to say, all right, we want these 3 things changed. You also have the ability to just make amendments, like Councilmember Downing has indicated. If he wants a specific language in the resolution that includes low to moderate income housing flexibility in TID, which is on the league's legislative priorities, but is not currently drafted in ours, you can make that amendment, you get a second, you can improve it. The same with anything else that you've all brought up, downtown or others, that you want to move from one category to a different, from future to current. You also can say to us, you got too much on here. Like, we like what you came up with, but we want you to just focus on these 3 things. That'd be glorious if you want to do that. This is a very, very, if not aggressive, it's a very assertive approach to legislative priorities. So we're not resting for our residents.
As long as we got Tristan on the phone, I hate to have him just sit there and not say anything. How crazy is it out there?
It's been a slow few weeks here in DC. I appreciate the opportunity to participate tonight, and I thought Scott captured our outlook specifically on the core and the fire station project well. Continuing to monitor closely, but still continuing to receive very strong indications on both fronts. But to Scott's point, securing future appropriations, especially for the Kinney project, is something that our team is, actively gaming out and ensuring that we have backup plans in place to secure federal funding for that. If, for example, the 206 pathway was no longer the preferred pathway for the project with the Corps. So I thought Scott captured it well, but wanted to just echo that that's something our team is closely monitoring too.
So with the new government out there, you kind of know what we've been going after for priorities and what you guys have been helping us with. Have you seen anything or heard anything that tells you that, nope, there's no way that's gonna work?
Yeah, I would say the priorities that were laid out tonight align well with where we've gone. And in general, I think the priorities that we worked on continue to be really valid. Scott talked a little bit about the transition from the RAISE program under the Biden administration to the BUILD program under President Trump. That is a process that our team was monitoring very closely, and one that we've kind of seen play out in a similar way across the federal government, where a previous administration's focus on equity and environmental sustainability, those programs have remained largely the same in terms of direction. Overall, there are still infrastructure programs that are funding major transportation projects. However, now they might be talking more about economic benefit, the flow of commerce, or addressing persistent poverty. So I think that there's still ways for us, whether it's public safety, like the project we're working on with the police department, or the Main Street project that was previewed tonight. We're very much kind of looking at similar programs, but potentially focusing in different areas as we kind of position the city's projects to succeed.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, anybody else have any questions about anything? No? Good, we can, you have anything else, Scott? Tristan, do you have anything?
Good to hear. Appreciate the opportunity to join tonight.
Yeah, appreciate the good discussion. It's always good for us to hear you kind of talking with each other and getting an idea of what, and I'm glad that it sounds like we're pretty close to the mark on what you're looking for. So we're happy to carry these forward for you on behalf of you and the residents.
Okay, well, we can call it early then. Thanks, Tristan. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll just go into recess till council meeting at 6:30.
Scott, do we need to make a motion to change the improving public safety, or are you just gonna do that? Okay. Okay. Well, then I'll ask